Amidst the chaos, a sense of anticipation hung in the air. Marcus Valorous, a royal guard for Solomon, the king of Alma, was a man of imposing build and dense, lean muscle. His armor adorned with intricate gold filigree and the symbols of Alma. He watched the unfolding battle with a growing mix of frustration and respect for the Dravidian champion. Solomon's presence on the battlefield was unmistakable as he and his gold-clad guard pushed their way to the front line. He led the Alman forces with the authority of a king and the ferocity of an Ender, his fiery sword and shield lighting up the night as he carved his way towards Wolf. His people revered him for the prosperity he had brought to Alma, despite how the kingdom typically felt about Enders. But in this moment, he was a warrior first and foremost, the conqueror king. He took his throne, then the neighboring nation, and then that title. The clash of Wolf and Solomon was inevitable. Their eyes were pulled to each other's silhouettes, highlighted by their unearthly weapons. "Men, with me, to victory!" shouted the king of Alma. "My lord, are you sure this is a wise idea?" shouted Marcus to his king, trying to pierce the din of battle. Valerie Themis, another of the king's royal guards, a large woman who dwarfed both her king and Marcus, grabbed Solomon's arm, halting him in place. She was careful not to touch the shield he brandished, as she spun him to face her easily, for it would burn her as surely as any other Ender's weapon. He pulled free of her grip and gave her a chastising glare as he said, "Dear Valerie, Marcus, I know it's your job, but you can't save me from my duties, my responsibilities." Solomon returned his gaze to the Dravidian line. His men now rushed past him to engage the enemy, eager to claim glory for their king. Wolf, his chains still in motion, saw the fresh soldiers approaching the line, backed by their Ender king. He felt the fight leaving his body with each swing, but he knew he was needed now more than ever. A fury overtook him, a burning furnace of wrath that threatened to melt everything he was, his loyalty, his pride, his strength. Flashes of memories not his own flooded him. His vision turned red and tunneled. A beat like a war drum pounded in his ears. He fought against the flood and fury, pulling the chains tight on the monster inside himself. It roared, and he realized he was flying through the air, chains lashing and thrashing as he sailed. The monster's roar was one born from his own throat. Lilander watched in horror with the group of witches she had rallied to her, as she struggled to reach Wolf. She had come to pull him from the fray, before her worst fears became a reality. The shifting throng of densely packed soldiers, swaying back and forth in a desperate bid for survival, made moving towards the man an impossible task. The journey was made all the more difficult by his newest erratic behavior. The Dravidians that had recently come to his rescue now retreated away from him. The soft glow of his tattoos were now a raging inferno. She watched helplessly as it spread across his body, like the tentacles of some hellish beast. She had to reach him soon. Wolf snarled and growled, snapping the chains back to himself. They made an audible sizzling sound as they hit his palms, as if the skin now burned hotter than the chains themselves. He roared again and spun like a top, releasing the chains. He danced like one of the witches across the armor of the dead, the chains whipping through the darkness, leaving tracers of light. Those almonds that had just rallied now broke under the onslaught of this hellfire beast, who left a trail of smoldering armor and ash behind it. The Almond King knew before he stepped foot onto this wretched land that he would have to be the one to kill the Dravidian Ender. Solomon walked purposely and calmly towards the clash that would define this battle, perhaps this war. The eyes of the two formidable Enders, Wolf and Solomon, locked onto each other across the battlefield. It was a moment of silent acknowledgement, a recognition of destiny's call. Both champions were bound by their abilities, their roles as warriors, and the weight of their respective nations. Solomon's armor gleamed in the harsh light cast by his Ender weapons. The kingdom of Alma had flourished under his rule, even it had come at the cost of war and conquest. Solomon moved towards Wolf, his sword and shield in hand. He did so with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat. He was a king in both title and action, and his very presence on the battlefield inspired his troops. His gold-clad guard moved in tandem with their king. Wolf, on the other hand, was defiance, a living embodiment of hope. His chains whirled through the air as he continued his reckless dance forward until none but Solomon and his guard stood before him. Solomon recognized Wolf for what he was, a relentless predator, one that had been backed into a corner. Cuts and gashes marred the Ender's body. A broken arrow protruded from the man's unarmored shoulder. The mask he wore was stained with blood. Deep scratches cratered its surface. He gave Solomon a malevolent, smoldering glare, filled with the promise of violence. Solomon understood why his men had fled. There would be no punishments later. He waved his guard away as he approached. They would pose more a hindrance than help for this fight. As Wolf and Solomon closed the distance between them, the battlefield seemed to hold its breath, as if nature itself recognized the significance of this encounter. Solomon raised his sword, its blade gleaming like a shard of sunlight. Wolf tightened his grip on the chains as he took 2 drunken steps before jumping at Solomon with a snarl. Solomon took the blow from the twisting chain easily with his shield, parrying the other with his sword. The clash of the 2 weapons reverberated through the desert, a symphony. Each meeting of the weapon came with a loud ringing noise, like that of a tuning fork. A chorus of echoes greeted them back. The battlefield had fallen still, the screams of war silent among the melody. It was as if the weapons were meant for this, to meet each other in battle. Perhaps every eye had been drawn to the 2 warriors, or perhaps the unnaturally beautiful sound simply drowned the noise out. Either way, this was one of the things Lilandra had feared most. Within the momentary stillness, she saw an opening through the crowd. She shoved through her own allies. Her small coven snapped out of their reverie, her movements waking those around her. The fight seemed to come roaring back to life with a sudden scream. Solomon's shield became a bulwark against Wolf's relentless assault. Each strike, each swing of the chains, was met with an unwavering defense. As the duel continued, both warriors burned with an intensity. The air around them shimmered like the heat off a midday dune. Sweat dripped down their brows and puffed away in an instant. Neither of the men seemed to notice, focused as they were on killing the other. Solomon knew time was on his side as he watched Wolf fumble, barely able to dodge a blow from his short sword in time. But he also knew the sickly sweet temptation of the inner power, how it always wanted more, how you wanted to give it more, to delve deeper into it, to feel those memories, that power, course through you. A desperate man might just do that, ending both their lives and his aspirations. He had to end this quickly, before that could happen. Each strike, each parry, Solomon the King of Alma defended with a proficiency born of years of training and experience. His red-hot kite shield, which had become the new emblem of his kingdom, held firm against Wolf's furious attacks. With each swing of his sword, he sought to breach Wolf's defenses, to exploit any weakness in the Dravian champion's assault. Wolf, on the other hand, fought with a wavering resolve. The chains that adorned his arms whirled through the air with lagging precision, each strike probing Solomon's defenses. He tried to end the duel while slipping in and out of control. A slave again, this time to the memories. His body moved on its own to the practiced motions in his head. He felt like he was falling into the molten core of himself. Marcus watched the battle unfold. He knew the stakes were high, and the outcome of this duel would determine the course of the conflict. His loyalty to Solomon ran deep, and he respected him for his unwavering courage, but he couldn't help but believe his king was risking too much. Valerie stood by, her large and muscular frame an imposing figure among the guard. She too admired Solomon, even if he angered her at times. The man didn't have the disposition of a king or a general in times like these. He would rather risk his life on the front line. She watched the duel like a hawk, hoping she wouldn't have to interject, but prepared to do so if she saw her king begin to lose. With each passing moment, the outcome became more certain. The battlefield was a cauldron of chaos and violence, Enderlight thrashing about like a wildfire. The sun had long since faded to shadows, but from across the battlefield, Wolf shone like it, his tattoo burning blindingly. The chains, spreading, seemed to pulse with anticipation. Wolf bashed against the shield trying to overpower Solomon. Solomon pulled himself behind it, putting his weight into it as he pushed forward with a roar. Wolf slapped the sand at the Almond King's feet with his chains, forcing Solomon back into a defensive position. He bounced on his heels a few steps back from Solomon. The chains fell limp to his sides as he stopped his dance of death. A brief moment of clarity had come to him, and he seized it. The Almond King watched Wolf, expecting a sudden return to battle. The burning chain-link tattoos couldn't hide the dried blood, sweat, and caked dirt that coated the champion's skin, nor could it hide his ragged breast. His arms hung limp at his side, shaking with exhaustion. If this was a trick, Solomon did not intend to fall for it. He waited patiently. Wolf, with a loud sigh, walked forward slowly, his legs unsteady. He gripped his chains in his hands again, tightly. Then he charged Solomon, swinging the chain in his right hand in a downward arc. Solomon blocked the chain easily with the shield in his left hand. Wolf swung the chain in his left hand horizontally, Solomon parried it with the sword, then he spun the short sword, wrapping the chain around it. Solomon jabbed the tangled sword into the ground, pinning the chain. He didn't release the sword's handle as he lifted the shield, anticipating a strike. Wolf pulled on the chain, but it didn't budge under the weight of Solomon's sword. He thought to strike with his right hand, but he saw Solomon's shield raised, and he knew the strike would never reach him. So he charged instead, wrapping the chain around his arm as he ran. Solomon was surprised he would charge. When he stepped within 5 feet of Solomon, he released the sword handle, freeing the chain as the sword whooshed from existence. He shifted his position and swung the shield horizontally in front of him. Wolf, off balance by Solomon's sudden shift, tried to dip below it. He slid across the sand, his legs parted trying to get as low as possible. His neck craned as the strike slid across the right side of the mask. The leather strap snapped, and it fell off as the shield sliced off Wolf's right ear. Wolf, off balance and in pain, with no leverage, swung the coiled chain on his right hand into Solomon's chest. The swing had no power behind it, but it still made Solomon stumble backwards a step, melting a hole in his armor. Gritting, Solomon swung his right hand out at Wolf, and the short sword flashed back into it. Wolf rolled backwards, away from the blade, snapping the chain in his left hand up weakly in defense. Solomon beat the chain away with the sword, then he put the shield down and charged. Wolf tried to roll onto his feet, but his tired legs were uncooperative. He managed to find his feet just as Solomon reached him, lifting his right hand still coiled in the chain up in defense. Solomon slammed into him with the shield, pushing Wolf backwards. Wolf tried to push back with his right arm, as the superheated shield blistered the arm underneath the chains, but Solomon had too much weight and power behind the shield. Solomon lifted the sword in his right hand up, leveling it with Wolf's neck over the shield. Wolf saw the strike coming the moment before he struck, and he caught the sword with the chain in his left hand, catching it between the links, pinning it. Solomon tried to muscle the sword, and it inched forward. Wolf spun the chain in his left hand, tying the blade up further. He pulled tight, and the blade locked. Solomon saw the pointlessness of pushing the blade further, so instead he pushed the shield. Wolf desperately tried not to lose his balance, as he held the blade and pushed against the shield. Solomon began to pull the blade back, taking Wolf's chain with it. Wolf slipped and the shield suddenly hopped up, pressing against his face. The chains on his arm pressed against his chest. Wolf roared an ethereal howl of agony as the shield pressed into the right side of his face, momentarily catching his skin ablaze before melting it off with a horrific sizzle. His right eye made a terrible popping noise as it exploded under the heat. Lolander watched the duel between Wolf and Solomon rage on as she struggled through the dense front line. The battlefield, an unforgiving expanse of dust, darkness, and shifting bodies stretched out before her. The fate of nations hung in the balance, and yet, her current opposition was only the darkness of the night and her fellow countrymen. She screamed, punched, and wriggled her way through the men, all while trying not to trip over them in the black. It sounded like she was having more luck than the witches that followed her, but she didn't dare turn to look. She was distracted enough watching the Enders fight in between shoving her way towards them. The desert winds whipped up the sand and gently whispered an unintelligible dimmer note. Lolander realized the crowd had stilled once more, tension pinning them in place, and she looked up at the Enders once again, terrified of what she might see. The two men were locked in a vicious grapple, vying for supremacy, and she knew it was only a matter of time before Wolf slipped, trying to hold himself upright. Solomon pushed into him, and Wolf screamed in pain. A bright flare of light winked in and out of existence, as whatever part of Wolf had been touched momentarily burst into flames. Lolander found herself screaming with him. Has this all been pointless? No. She wouldn't let it end like this. Not before she even had a chance to really test herself. She turned her scream into an echo of the desert's whisper, and gave it power. The solemn note pushed through the crowd of men, parting them before her. Before she realized it, she was running through them, cursing every bad word she knew, while she summoned a ball of electric energy between her hands. This was a bad idea. The small ball whirred in her hands. She separated them. Aiming her right hand out, she screamed as she extended her index and middle finger. The ball transformed into a spiral that chased at the outside of her hand, starting from her palm. It shot out of her fingers like the bolt of a crossbow. It was weak, raw. She hadn't formed it properly. She simply didn't have time. The ball arced towards Solomon as Lolander mentally prepared her next spell. A hulking woman of a guard stepped from the shadows, pulling Solomon back like he was a fighting puppy. the ball lazily sailed by the two of them. Wolf for a moment was dragged with Solomon. As he sagged to the ground, the chains on his wrists disappeared. The supernatural marks on his body pulsed meagerly a few times, then went dark. Before Lilandra could muster her next attack, one of the Dravian soldiers cursed loudly as he threw a javelin at Solomon. One of Solomon's gold and white-clad guards batted away with a mace as he stepped in front of Solomon, raising a large tower shield. Lilandra knew she only had moments as Solomon's guard moved forward to ring him. The guard in front of Solomon stepped forward. He raised his mace high. His eyes narrowed at Lilandra, then he turned to Wolf, motionless on the ground. The man swung the mace down in an arc towards Wolf's head. Lilandra was ready, though she had changed the spell at the last second, so it lost some power. The sonic shockwave she had summoned earlier had given her an idea, so she refined it this time and narrowed it. Instead of a scream or a sad note, it came out as a high-pitched whistle, visibly moving through the air. It hit the guard square in the center of his tower shield. Even with the loss of power, the shield crumpled under the impact. The man went flying backwards into Solomon and the other giant guard. She had chosen the spell in hopes of not hurting Wolf more than he already was, if he was even alive still. She wasn't sure she had accomplished her goal. She moved forward trying to reach him, but another one of Solomon's guards rushed at her. Valerie was at a loss for words as she watched the slender Dravian witch toss Marcus in his full set of war armor like he was a rag doll. She tried to move in front of Solomon to catch him. Solomon quickly extinguished his weapons and tried to escape. Valerie had to settle for catching Solomon and Marcus as Marcus slammed into Solomon, knocking him off his feet. She looked up, hoping the surprisingly capable young woman wasn't still in pursuit, and was relieved to find that she was now in a hand-to-hand fight with another of the guards. "Guards, form a wall!" she shouted as she helped the two men regain their feet. Solomon was quick to recover, pulling his weapons back into existence as the guards started to form around them. Lilandra had managed to get the guard to drop his weapon and shield through the clever use of heat waves nudged by some magic. In doing so, the guard must have figured out that it was her swaying motions that shaped the magic. Now he pressed her harder, making sure she was always defensively stepping away from him. She wasn't a trained hand-to-hand fighter. She wasn't even a fighter. He struck out at her, aiming his gauntleted hand at her face. She backed away from it, but he caught her wrist with his other hand. He pulled her towards him as he swung again. She tried to move out of the way, but the metal-covered hand caught her in the left cheek, snapping her head back violently and splitting her lip. Little stars spun in her narrowing vision as she felt the metal fingertips clutch around her throat, squeezing tight. She coughed, or tried to, panicking as she punched and kicked. Her hands and feet bounced off the man's armor like a child's fit. She felt at the hand, pulled at it, trying to loosen its grip. A moment of calm washed over her as her vision faded. Lilandra put her hand on the man's forearm. Unable to hold onto his arm, she let it lay limp, palm down. Then she let the raw, unfiltered magic run through her. An electric current ran out in response. It traced through the guard's armor, then back to her. Both of them spasmed uncontrollably at the mercy of the magic. She tried to cut it off and realized she already had. As the current continued its path, she blacked out. Valerie watched the situation devolve in moments. The Dravian army now charged once again over their fallen champion. The guard pushed them back as fresh almond troops flooded in. The field had become utter chaos. The only still place in this hurricane lay within the circle the guard provided their king. Valerie knew her king wouldn't let that last for long, as he stood a mere meter from the guards in front of him. Solomon gave her a slight glance over his shoulder. His eyes betrayed nothing of his intent. Perhaps he wanted to make sure she was still there, or perhaps he read her mind. He said something she couldn't make out, and the guards moved aside for him. He pulled his shield up and marched forward, peeking over the top of the fearsome ender weapon as he moved, lashing out with the short sword at anyone unfortunate enough to be in his path. The King of Alma fought with a controlled precision that spoke of his years of training and experience. His shield was formidable, an unyielding defense and a devastating weapon. He pushed through the Dravians, scattering the group in front of the guards with an unsettling ease. They tried to slip under, over, or to the side of the shield, but were met with curt responses from the short sword. They tried to fall back, to find some room to breathe as almond soldiers poured over them. Lilandra awoke in a stupor, a ringing piercing in her ears. She sat on her knees. The guard she had been fighting slumped across from her. His hands still weakly clung onto her neck. She was surrounded by Dravian soldiers, some pushing past her and the guard. Others frantically tried to move out of the way, retreating. She slapped the guard's hand off her neck and he let out a weak moan. She ignored him. She had bigger problems. She couldn't see Solomon or his guard from her hands and knees, but she knew he was close. The flashes of light and the smell of burning bodies gave away his presence. The screams of her countrymen gave a more precise location. She scanned the ground, hoping to find Wolf before he did. A hand grasped her shoulder and she spun around, almost screaming in panic. It was one of the older witches she had talked into taking on this doomed mission. The woman was dressed in the royal red colors, signifying her as a capital witch. Her kind eyes looked Lolander up and down behind her veil. As she appraised her condition, she said in a creaky voice, My, girl, we've been looking for you everywhere." Lolander looked behind the older woman to see the makeshift coven she had formed. Marcus watched the battle in frustration as he stood behind the royal guards. The tiny Dravian witch had essentially made it pointless for him to be on the battlefield anymore. His left arm hung limp at his side, his large tower shield long since abandoned. She had probably managed to crack a few of his ribs too. He clutched his mace tight as his gaze snapped back and forth between Valerie, Solomon, and the guard who had stepped in to take his place. Valerie stood a step behind Solomon to his right, her large armored frame shifting back and forth. She barely moved when she slapped her large tower shield down, blocking her king's flanks. She let the shield and her heavy armor do most of the fighting for her as she jabbed out with her short spear, like one would a toothpick into an olive. The guard on Solomon's left didn't fare as well. His nervousness of Solomon's shield was evident as he warily stepped away when the king moved. Marcus cursed his failure. He should be the one there, and if his king ended up hurt, he would never forgive himself. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. A gentle song slithered through the battlefield. The hairs on Marcus's neck stood on end, and he had the overwhelming urge to run to his king, to jump in front of him. A boom sounded, like the crashing of rocks from a cliff face. A large puff of sand shot into the air and men screamed. Marcus ran as fear made him give in to the urge. He ran toward his king, towards the screaming. A swirling whirlpool of sand greedily snatched at soldiers, Alman and Dravian alike. Men disappeared beneath its surface, devoured by the fine granules. Valerie sat anchored on the outside of it. She held Solomon up. His feet were being pulled towards the center. Valerie struggled against the current, but all she could do was manage to not be pulled in further. Marcus ran to them. He tried to reach them with his good arm, but had no leverage to pull them in. Valerie looked at him. She said nothing. The look of her eyes said it all. He snarled at her unspoken refusal. He dug himself into the sand with his good hand and his legs. He stretched out his ruined arm. She grabbed it without hesitation, pulling her massive frame and Solomon forward. His arm popped and cracked. The arm stretched weirdly, and he wondered if it would be ripped off as he faded in and out of consciousness. He barely registered it when she let go of his arm as she stepped from the sandy pit. Dravian horns sounded, marking their retreat. Solomon watched them run into the darkness. As his men moved to pursue, he motioned to Valerie. She nodded, gave Marcus a consoling pat on the back, then pulled a horn from the bag on her waist. She sounded it, giving the signal to retreat. Even if we didn't gain any ground today, Solomon thought, this was surely a victory.